One of the many insufferable aspects of my university is the housing. Even with our multi-billion-dollar endowment, we somehow managed to create housing conditions that would have been more befitting of a Victorian orphanage turned work camp. In the past, I've covered some of my biggest gripes with the physical aspects of my dorm life, from the unfinished ceilings and walls in the newest dorm on campus, to the piss stains and human effluent that coat the yellowed walls of our oldest dorm, but I've yet to really talk about some of the students. It's my firm belief that these dorms act as congregating spots for only the most neurotic students the university can attract. Either that or they're pumping something through the vents that's making people go crazy. So here's an abbreviated synopsis of some of the more atrocious incidents I've seen as a part of student housing. The first incident I'll start with occurred the day I got back from my winter break one year. I had just finished unpacking my luggage and was about to go downstairs to retrieve my laundry when I heard the fire alarm go off. A voice came over the intercom and informed us all that there had been a small emergency on one of the floors and that we were all to stay in place as they figured out what was happening. I might have been tempted to believe them had I not heard the commotion outside my window and decided to look down. There, parked on the street, were a squadron of police cars blocking off the entire street, 2 fire trucks, and a handful of other supporting emergency vehicles. None of them had their sirens on, but there were quite a few people in uniforms busily walking around between the vehicles, seemingly consulting on something. I called the rest of my friends in my dorm apartment to come and take a look, but before we could start debating about what had actually happened, I heard another announcement come over the loudspeaker. The person at the front desk said that, although the nature of the emergency had not been determined, everyone on the floor of interest was to report back to their room immediately. Everyone else was to shelter in place as previously instructed. Now, you have to understand that I absolutely do not trust the people who run the dorms, the reason for which will become clear to you as you listen to some of the later stories in this video. So when they told me that they hadn't figured out what was going on but were calling students back to the floor anyways, I concluded that something must have gone horribly wrong. Under the pretense of getting my laundry done, I went downstairs to the lobby to try and get some answers, only to find the front desk abandoned and the doors to the outside locked. Not only that, but they'd placed trash cans in front of the doors so that, even if we were able to break the locks, we would still have to push these massive garbage bins out of the way before we could make it out. It was at this point that I saw a SWAT truck pull up outside and decided that instead of hanging around and getting a full-course meal of 5.56 rifle rounds by startling the nice men now running into the building from that emergency exit, I'd just quietly go back to my room and lay low. Keep in mind that SWAT was rushing into the building at the same time as students are being asked to return to their rooms, so I can only presume that the front desk people thought it'd be a funny joke for a student just following instructions to come around the corner, startle the SWAT team, and promptly get sent to an XXXTentacion concert. After returning to my room, I realized that I actually knew somebody on the affected floor. While asking him about what SWAT was up to, he told me that the bomb defusal squad had also showed up. He further went on to tell me that it was the people in those big, green, bulky uniforms with face masks, so unless he was talking about somebody cosplaying as Shrek with COVID, I can only assume that he must have actually seen the real thing. This kind of tense standoff would go on for nearly 3 hours, at which time we received an incident report from the front desk that all of the commotion had actually been for just a little bit of smoke and that there was nothing to worry about, and they let us out of our rooms. Now, I know the school loves to waste money, but I cannot imagine that calling the police department, our own school security force, the fire department, ambulances, SWAT, and bomb defusal for just some smoke would go over well. That's like if the ATF and the FBI had said they'd executed the Waco siege because they'd seen a fly on one of the compound walls. Needless to say, none of us in the apartment believed a word of the explanation and started to brainstorm our own scenarios. Someone said it might have actually been just a small fire, but the massive emergency vehicles outside and the fact that the fire alarm had been manually triggered by the front desk pointed against that. Another friend suggested that maybe they found radiological materials or explosives in the students' room, which would explain the en masse response of emergency services. But then why would they call students back to the floor? As callous as they are towards the livelihood of their own students, the lawsuits that result from calling students back to an active crime scene should have been enough to deter them from doing something that stupid. Yet another roommate put forth that maybe there wasn't an incident on that floor at all, and that somebody in the administration had been caught in a compromising position. Calling all the students back to the floor was a way of removing potential witnesses from the scene of the incident so it could be resolved internally by the school. Personally, I thought they discovered a dead body in one of the rooms and were calling students back to the floor so that they could ID who the body belonged to by seeing who didn't return. The next day, however, one of my roommates made an important realization. Because the city's police had actually gotten involved, the records of any arrest would have had to been made public. With this knowledge, we combed through the city's police department data until we found incident description that matched the time and the place of what we'd seen. As it turns out, the police had actually arrested a student who had burned down his room. A motive hasn't been released to this day, so it's hard to say if the student intended to burn down the dorm or he was just a brain-dead moron trying to do tech deck tricks with a leaky Zippo lighter. But the way in which the incident has been treated by law enforcement and the school, like the fact that the student hasn't been allowed back into the dorms, seems to indicate the former. Keep in mind, this was all the day I got back from my winter break before the new semester had even started. Editing Jeff here, by the way. As I was drawing the frames for this video, 2 more students in different dorms both turned into arsonists and burned down their rooms. At least one was also arrested, charged with arson, and thrown out of housing. Oh, and on top of that, we had 2 more fires. Fun times. Continuing with the topic of fire alarms, the Gulag dorm I lived in first year had quite a few incidents in relation to those. There was yet another student-turned-arsonist incident where someone had set the bathroom trash can on fire, but interestingly, or horrifyingly enough, that wasn't the most egregious occasion on which the fire alarms went off. I'm unclear as to whether this is the case with other schools, but our school used to have monthly fire alarm drills in the dorms. These would rarely be told to you ahead of time, so you would often just be minding your own business, only to be interrupted by the ear-splitting howl of fire alarms and dragged outside to wait for an hour. What's worse was how seriously some of the RAs would take this whole thing. I remember one time I was sitting on a bench outside the building as I waited for us to be let back into the building when an RA approached me and told me to get up. I told her I'd be just a minute since I was sending an email to my professor, but she wasn't having any of it. She leered in front of my face like some sort of Looney Tunes villain and told me that if I didn't follow her instructions, she'd escalate the incident to the deans. Keep in mind that this is somebody who is at most 2 years older than me, trying to boss me around like I'm one of her villainous henchmen. Like, I'm sorry that you were never charismatic enough to achieve any leadership position on your own merits, and that you have unsettled authority figure issues as a result of being emotionally neglected by your parents, but letting that tiny bit of power go to your head is another degree of unhinged. I told her to have a pleasant dinner consisting of her own excrement, to which she angrily demanded to know my name. I told her that I wasn't even a student, and I was just some random homeless guy sitting on the bench, and before she could slap me as she was raising her hand to do, I disappeared into the mob of students pushing their way back into the dorm. But even the attitude certain people had towards enforcing these fire drills was nothing compared to how the front desk executed them. Some students, like those who were dragged out of their showers during the drills by overeager RAs, might disagree with me, but I can't really speak to those experiences. The front desk would often choose not only the most obscene times of day, but also the worst possible times of the month. So not only were there a myriad of occasions where we'd be dragged out of our dorms at 3 or 4 a.m. with threats of disciplinary action if we didn't trudge out into the below zero weather, but these would regularly occur during midterms or finals week. Students who stayed up to 1 or 2 a.m. studying for their finals would be rudely awakened having only slept a couple of hours and, after freezing their butts off outside, would find it impossible to go back to sleep again, instead opting to stay up until their morning exams. To add insult to injury, one semester the front desk even sent out an email after they'd called one of these obscene fire drills with an illustration that said, "Remember, sleep is temporary, but GPA is forever." They must have been a urologist the way they were taking the piss there. Among these fire drills, however, one stands out as particularly egregious. It began just like every other irritating fire drill, a 3 a.m. alarm that went off the night before midterm started. However, this ear-splitting alarm was interrupted by something even more grating, the sound of some fart-huffing, paint-chip-eating, sewer-diving goblin at the front desk. In my half-stupor, I could barely understand what they were saying, but I remember being told that this was a test of the dining hall's fire alarm. I figured that maybe somebody at the front desk had finally stroked out and forgotten the difference between a dorm and a dining hall and prepared to go back to sleep when, not even 10 minutes later, the alarm went off again. The same gormless inbred slobbered over the PA mic and told us that this was a test of the dining hall's fire alarm functionality. Now thoroughly awake and irritated, I realized that this troglodyte was actually trying to test the dining hall fire alarm and was somehow triggering the dorm alarm as well. For some context, and for viewers who haven't watched this video, the dining hall and the dorm are physically a part of the same building, but students are not allowed to go from one to the other from the inside. The school's justification is that it'd be too much work to put up 2 cashiers to check both entrances, which seems like a really lame excuse when room and board cost me the equivalent of a Honda Civic each year. Anyways, the official university line has always been that although the 2 facilities are physically connected, they're completely different buildings and should be treated as such. So imagine my immense surprise when I found out that the Craigslist electricians they'd hired had wired the dining hall and dorm fire alarms into the same switch. I remember going down to the front desk to tell them to stuff it, but I found the post deserted. Never mind this appalling lack of security in spite of the fact that someone had been shot to death on the street behind our dorm earlier that year, I realized that somebody must actually be inside the dining hall triggering the alarms. Given that the wind chill was more than 10 below that night, I decided not to trudge out there in my sweatpants and t-shirt to confront the moron responsible, and instead just went back upstairs. Alongside everyone else in my dorm, I endured these intermittent testing alarms for more than half an hour that night, and what did I receive for my troubles? Not only did the dorm never apologize for causing hearing damage for everyone without earplugs, they failed to even explain what had happened that night when I emailed the dean in charge. I don't know if they ever fixed that issue given that I moved out of that dorm, but I can only imagine the issues that must have arisen if they didn't. Imagine if someone threw ice cubes into the fryer in the cafeteria and they evacuated the nearly 1,000 student large dorm, or if yet another person in the dorms wanted to paint their room with napalm and that evacuated a 300 odd capacity cafeteria, about half of whose patrons at any one time don't even live in the attached dorm building. Admittedly, it's more of a nuisance than a safety concern, but if the school is going to justify making me walk outside in below freezing conditions to go to the cafeteria that is physically attached to my dorm by saying that the dorm and the cafeteria are separated, at the very least, they could hire somebody with a fully formed frontal cortex to wire their alarm systems.